I'm really excited to talk to Tim Nguyen. Tim, thank you for coming to talk to me. Thank you for being willing to talk to me. I'm just going to introduce you a little bit. So you're currently a research software engineer at Google, where you've been since 2019. You got your PhD in math from MIT in 2011. You were in academia, but you left academia in 2017 and then went to Google a couple of years later. We are going to be talking today about Eric Weinstein's theory of geometric unity and your rebuttal of it and your experiences associated with publishing that rebuttal. And we'll get into all the details in a second. But before we do, I just wanted to ask you, out of curiosity, where were you born and raised and stuff like that?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I haven't talked a lot about my biological upbringing and all that stuff. Yeah, I was born in San Jose, California. So I'm a California kid, I guess. I lived here actually most of my life, but was gone for quite a while. That's what academia does for you. I went to Caltech for undergrad, then moved to MIT, then lived in New York for my first postdoc, then Michigan for my second. Then I actually briefly went to DC. My first job in industry, I was a data scientist for the patent office. So the joke was I was on the Einstein track. Right.
Albert
Einstein worked at the patent office.
He was the Swiss patent clerk who changed the world.
That's right. So I was the U.S. version of that, and then I joined a startup, and then I joined Google. Yeah.
And also, I was intrigued because you've said in a few of your conversations that you left academia, obviously, and I think we're kind of unhappy in academia. We don't need to go into great detail, but can you give the sort of nutshell version of why you left?
Sure. I don't think there's anything particularly unique about my experience insofar as, this has been discussed by Eric Weinstein and many others. But one salient thing that I observed is that, part of the perk of securing tenure as an academic is to have the freedom to, think and work on whatever you want. And I didn't see actually the people who have tenure as being those that are working on pushing the frontier, being daring or being bold. Kind of the way you read about science in the textbooks is, we're discovering the frontiers of the universe, so to speak. And I found academia to be a very, instead, more about knowing more and more about less and less, right? Hyper specialization, but not only that. Not only was it narrowing in a technical level, but even in sort of a level of curiosity and scientific spirit. So I feel like the typical trajectory of an academic is you do a PhD, where you gain expertise, and then what you do is you get a postdoc under the friend of your advisor, and then you write more papers under that mentorship. You keep going in this straight line from your PhD, and you continue going to the same conferences with the same people. And if you continue in that trajectory, you'll basically be eating the same breakfast for the rest of your life. And that, I'm being very, I'm grossly caricaturing academia, but it felt a lot like that, where you would go to these conferences in whatever, mathematical physics, and the same people would only be talking to the same people, and they're not interested in your, adjacent set of ideas. And so it became like this sort of very performative exhibitionist. Oh, I'm just sort of writing papers to further this incremental thing, and nothing really daring or risky or whatever. And so so from an intellectual challenge standpoint, that was sort of my issue with academia. Yeah.
That's really interesting to hear, because I thought maybe it was just because might be hard to get tenure, and maybe you had to go to places you didn't like Michigan State. I mean, it's interesting. Actually, what you just said is you know, it corresponds fairly closely to Eric Weinstein's critique of academia. So, and that critique of academia is obviously not exclusive to him, but I actually wasn't expecting you to say that. I thought it might be more mundane. Like, it's hard to get a tenure track position in a place that you want to live, and postdocs like from year to year. But it's interesting you have this deeper critique in addition to those things.
Yeah,
but
I didn't want to leave with that just because I felt that's kind of banal and true of most people who leave academia. I think it's fair to say that had I gotten offers that then I would have stayed in academia. Let me actually go a little deeper. So in some sense, I'm a little bit ambivalent about how to evaluate my academic career. On the one hand, I feel like most academics do when they leave academia, you know, there's sort of that failure mentality, and I certainly felt that when I left. And you know, there's still sort of that whatever scar, if you want, in some ways. You know, having been years out, you know, I've healed in many ways. But if I wanted to use some emotional language like that, so yeah, I wasn't getting tenure track interviews even, and part of it was I was working in this area of mathematical physics, of trying to make mathematical sense of quantum field theory, which, if you know you're in that area, sounds crazy because it's one of these areas that's sort of, you know, very difficult and sort of not the thing you should try to do as a young researcher without tenure. You know, if you're a young researcher, you should be working in a well-established field. I wasn't working in such a well-established field, doing my own thing. And I was sort of trying to mix together many things together to make sense of quantum field theory. And so that was also problematic, because then I would write papers where people wouldn't be able to referee it, because if it just combined lots of different things. And so to long story short, I was working on what interests me, not on what necessarily interest others. And that's a double-edged sword, right? And so it was the combination of the lack of being able to actually fulfill myself intellectually and not being able to physically secure a job that, you know, ultimately led me to leave. The reason why I led with the intellectual discussion first is that, you know, if I was truly intellectually aligned with academia, right? There's a saying where there's, you know, he who has a why can suffer any how, right? Nietzsche said that, right? And so, you know, if I really felt that academia was going to let me thrive intellectually, you know, I would, you know, make the sacrifices, you know, living maybe nowhere, in the middle of nowhere or whatnot. But I felt, well, wait a minute, why am I making such sacrifices only to get something that's a perversion of why I wanted to be a scientist or a mathematician in the first place? You know, and I think there are a lot of articles of people that, you know, discourage people from going to academia. They think it's going to be this idyllic ivory tower where you get to ponder the great questions of life all the time. You know, so I basically kind of realized it was maybe sort of a dream that wasn't meant to be. And you know, there's a risk for staying, and there's a risk for not staying. And I felt also with the rise of machine learning that there was opportunity to get to venture into a new field and start something new where there was a lot of opportunity. So and actually I made the right choice, and I'm very glad I left, and I'm in a great place now. So in hindsight, it was a great decision. You were going to ask something.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that you're enjoying Google now. And just two quick things in response to what you said. First of all, I'm an assistant professor in political science at Lafayette, and my research to date is sort of the opposite of you. Before I had the capacity to develop a research program, I had to have one. And so I just kind of asked my advisor to give me one, which he did. And I ran with it for 6 or 7 years, but it's now not remotely the stuff that I'm most interested in. So there's a real disconnect between what I'm intellectually passionate about and what all of my research on has been to date. I enjoy my research, but just not as much, like not enough to hyper specialize in it. I'm actually more of a generalist. Like I like to learn about as much as I can, as many disciplines as I can, as much history as I can. So I think it's cool that you have been doing research on the things that truly interest you, even if it might have been more pragmatic to do research on something else. There was one other thing I wanted to say in response to what you said.
And actually, I should say, before I even knew about Eric Weinstein, I forgot how now, but I became aware of Peter Thiel before knowing about Weinstein. And actually, Thiel has a lot of funny quips about academia. There's a video where he says interdisciplinary is a dirty word in academia. And I definitely felt it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I guess the other thing I was going to say is that just for the viewers, it might be interesting to learn that what you, Tim, were interested in is intimately, deeply related to what Eric Weinstein has been talking about in his discussions on physics, and very related to Weinstein's theory of geometric unity. So you're one of relatively few people in the world with the capacity to evaluate, to assess Eric Weinstein's claims about physics. So that's very interesting too. And that's, I mean, we'll get into that, but I just wanted to note that. But that's correct, right?
Yeah. I think certainly before he wrote his paper, there were very few people that can evaluate that, just because Eric is writing in this sort of Harvard MIT style of gauge theory. And I think, Eric knows that for sure. And I think, he wasn't expecting somebody like me to come along and have the right skill set, because the set of people who do have the right skill set are mostly in academia, and they're not interested in this sort of challenging fringe theories like this, right? And so
right.
Yeah, and that's actually also kind of interesting. Actually that actually proves my point, because the point of tenure is to have the freedom to be completely creative, but to get tenure requires you to be so conservative that by the time you get there, you can't just flip the switch and say, oh, I'm going to be this free thinking person without no strings attached anymore. You've been conditioned to be a certain way. And so likewise, either by spirit or by training, I think the people in academia who want to all work on the same kinds of problems, they're not interested in maybe trying more random things, much less giving Eric the time of day to evaluate his theory. So actually,
right. And one thing I would add to that is that obviously there's a huge incentive to get tenure because it means lifetime job security, but but a lot of professional incentive, or a lot of incentives remain after you get tenure, right? So you still have incentives to stay on a certain track, because
that's right.
It will lead to prestige and
because you've
all kinds of opportunities.
Built academic capital. And so if you want to get the next grant, the next prize, you have to keep leveraging that, right? But I actually want to say, I had this reflection a while back, which is that had I actually stayed in academia and made it, I'm not sure I would want to critique Weinstein's theory, because what do I gain from it? There's no science to be gained from that. Mm-hmm. I'm losing the time I could spend furthering my own research, and I'm then soiling my own reputation by getting involved with someone who's not an academic. So it's not surprising that scientists ignore Weinstein's work, because they have nothing to gain from it, right? Mm-hmm. I think, I do find it a little sad that the people who could just, call Eric Weinstein out, in particular Brian Keating, of all people, don't do so when, in some sense, there could be a more responsibility towards the public view of science and information and things like that. But not going there yet. All I want to say is that the incentive structure is such that had I made it in academia, I wouldn't be somehow as free as I am now outside of academia to sort of comment on it. Because now at Google, this is a completely side pet project. It has nothing to do with my work. So I'm just having fun doing this, right? Whereas in academia, it would actually kind of soil my academic track, which sort of, academia, it's a very elite culture. So you want to have this pristine trajectory of undergrad, PhD, papers, prizes. You don't want to get into too many controversies, right? So I think if I had stayed in academia, I would have just been on that little, stayed in the ivory tower and not touched this. But here I am. So
if we get to the end of our conversation, I'm going to talk a lot about this issue.
Sure. Okay.
Because what I'm going to call the mainstream information landscape and the alternative information landscape are two very different things. You're now kind of operating in the alternative information landscape. Academia is one of the central institutions within the mainstream information landscape. And I'm going to ask some questions about those things a little later.
Sure.
All right. Okay. So before we get any further, I just want to make a disclaimer, which is that I like Eric Weinstein. I think the world is a better place with Eric Weinstein in it. And by the way, you may not hold these views, but I just want to make it clear. So I like Eric. I think the world is a better place with Eric Weinstein in it. I think he adds a lot of value to the information landscape. I've listened to dozens of hours of his content. I've learned a ton from him, even if I don't accept everything that he says. So I think my view of Eric probably differs somewhat from that of the hosts of Decoding the Gurus. I think they might weight the negative things about him more heavily and the positive things more lightly than I would, although I could be wrong. I'm saying this because I do have some very critical things to say about Eric in this context, in the context of your story and geometric unity, but I don't want viewers of this video to think that I ignore all of the positive things that he brings, because I don't. In fact, part of why I'm making this video is that I'm disappointed and, at the risk of sounding naive, a bit disillusioned by how he has treated you and responded to your rebuttal of geometric unity. So what I want to start by doing here is I want to go through a kind of bare bones objective chronology, one that Eric would agree with, I think. This chronology is objective in the sense that the events listed happened. Of course, which events I select for inclusion in the chronology could be misleading or unfair. I'm listing events that I think are going to come up in our conversation. But if I'm leaving anything out or placing undue emphasis on anything, it's not intentional. I know your side of the story better than I know Eric's. If I knew Eric's perspective better, perhaps this timeline would be different. But here goes. So in 2019, you joined Google as an AI researcher. You learned about Eric Weinstein in 2019, in 2019 from a colleague at Google. You consumed a fair amount of his content, especially his physics-related content.
Yeah, probably more like spring or summer of 2020 that I started learning about Eric. It was a while before I learned about stuff, but yeah, okay. But after I joined Google,
okay,
yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, correct me anytime. Okay, so on April 2nd, 2020, April 1st, April 2nd of 2020, last year, Eric released a first look at his theory of geometric unity on YouTube. The video is entitled "A Portal Special Presentation: Geometric Unity: A First Look." It includes his 2013 Oxford lecture and supplementary explanations. So that's April 1st, 2nd, 2020. August 12th, 2020, Eric appeared on Brian Keating's YouTube show, along with Sabine Hassenfelder and Lee Smolin, to discuss theories of everything. Around that time, late August, early September 2020, you, Tim, and Eric talked to each other twice, including about gauge theory and the Seiberg-Witten equations on a Discord voice chat for the portal. Okay, the most important item in this timeline is February 2021. You and the pseudonymous Theopolia published your rebuttal of geometric unity, or what you could infer about geometric unity from Eric's YouTube video and other podcast conversations. Your rebuttal paper is entitled "A Response to Geometric Unity." Again, this is the most important item on the timeline. Okay, then I don't know when exactly this happened, but you weren't able to publish the article on Archive, spelled ARXIV. Archive, for the listeners' understanding, is a free distribution service and open access archive where scholars can post scientific papers. And often scholars post on Archive to claim an idea before anyone else does. And since your paper was a rebuttal of a video and not of a peer-reviewed paper or book, the editors at Archive, I think, deemed your paper of insufficient interest or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Mm-hmm.
And so you published it just online, like you linked to it on Twitter and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, I should say, so I think we submitted it to the Archive on a Monday, and then it got, and then it was funny because that very night, Lex Fridman released his podcast with Eric Weinstein, the fourth and most recent one, where Eric announces that he's going to release the paper on Brian Keating's podcast. You know, he makes this big, revelatory announcement about that. And so the next day, and we're like, wow, this could be better timing because our paper's going to come out tomorrow at the perfect right time, actually. And then the next day, we got the rejection from the archive. Like, what the heck? This is so controversial, and we knew it would look bad if it became public. Eventually, it became public because I spilled the beans once it didn't matter anymore. But then we realized, okay, you know what? Screw the archive. We're going to go forward with it anyways. And then I just released it on Twitter that very same day. Also, because to mitigate any hypothesis that we were trying to interfere with get in front of Eric's paper. We didn't know that Eric was going to write a paper first. There's some people online saying, oh, why am I and Theo such dicks for writing a paper and not waiting for Eric? We didn't know that he was going to actually release the paper. So yeah.
Well, and Eric has accused you of trying to get out in front of the paper.
He suggested. I think that's right. He actually says that in Clubhouse that it was basically a kind of a hit piece trying to get in front of the paper. When if you actually look back at all the Brian Keating podcast episodes, Eric kept bragging about how he shouldn't have to write a paper. People should just watch the video. And, paper, it didn't happen, that kind of, language and speech. And so, we took him up on his word. He asked for feedback on the video, and we gave him feedback on the video. And it just so happened that our paper came out right as he announced his paper release, just by pure coincidence. So that's what happened. And
you published it in February, that's right?
That's right. I put it on my WordPress and Twitter on February. Yeah, the day after the Lex Fridman show came out.
And Sabine Hassenfelder, did she also publish it on her blog?
Yeah, I reached out to her, I think like a week later or two, something like that. And yeah, she agreed to host a blog post. Yeah.
Okay, so so you publish it in different places. Your WordPress site also gets published on Sabine Hassenfelder's blog in February of 2021. Now, on April 1st, 2021, a year after the release of Eric's YouTube video, he appears on Rogan, maybe the largest podcast in the world, and releases his first public written articulation of geometric unity, entitled Geometric Unity Author's Working Draft version 1.0. In this conversation, Joe Rogan brings up your rebuttal. So I just want to flag that or note that. On May 16th, 2021, Eric and Brian Keating, who is Brian Keating is a professor of astrophysics at UCSD, University of California at San Diego. And he also has a YouTube channel where he talks about physics with various physicists. Okay, so that's Brian Keating. Eric and Brian Keating are colleagues, friends. I'm not sure, but okay. So May 16th, 2021, Eric and Brian Keating co-hosted a Clubhouse conversation called Let's Talk About Physics, during which a math professor named Joseph brought up your rebuttal, Tim, resulting in a heated exchange with Eric. We'll get into the details later, but I'm just going to say that right now. Okay. The next month, June 11th, 2021, you appeared on the podcast Decoding the Gurus. This is a show in which the hosts analyze the arguments of people they identify as gurus, and these gurus span the ideological spectrum, from James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson to the Weinstein brothers to Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. You talk to them about your impressions of Weinstein and what you've experienced and observed since criticizing geometric unity. Just a week later, June 18th, 2021, you appeared on the YouTube show Eigenbros, which is hosted by two physicists, and you expounded your rebuttal at length, your paper. And by the way, you're a very good teacher. I can tell that you've taught people before. And I should say, anyone watching this who wants to go deep into the substance of geometric unity and Tim's critiques of it, watch the Eigenbros video, which I'll link in the show notes.
Just wondering, do you have a math and physics background at all, or to what extent? Just out of curiosity.
Say again. I'm sorry.
How much math physics training do you have?
I have no understanding of your paper other than I have no real understanding of it. I mean, I actually enjoy reading it because it's like I'm just in awe of your intelligence, and I mean everyone in this space, I'm in awe of their intelligence. But no, I can't. Just don't there's nothing there.
Okay.
Right. I mean, I took AP Calculus, but I've actually never taken a physics course in my life. Anyway.
Okay.
And my interest in this issue isn't because I'm interested in physics. It's because I'm interested in other things that we'll get to. But anyway, so right. So on June 18th, you appeared on Eigenbros and go into great detail about your paper. And anyone interested in the substantive math and physics details, which we will briefly go over, should definitely check that out. Tim has a blackboard, and it's like a class. Okay, so then the next month, July 13th, 2021, you appear on Robert Wright's The Wright Show. Wright is a scholar and the author of at least 2 books, The Moral Animal and Why Buddhism is True. Those are the 2 I'm familiar with. You and Robert talked about your critiques of geometric unity, and again, your impressions of Weinstein and your experiences and observations since releasing your paper. Then July 22nd, 2021 is today, and you're here.
All right.
Okay. So is there anything major that, from your perspective, I'm leaving out?
No, that you've been pretty thorough in your chronology.
Okay. Okay. So I want to begin with the actual substantive disagreement. Although, as I said, we're not going to go into as much detail as you did with the Eigenbros. And again, viewers with particular interest in the substantive disagreements between you and Weinstein should check out that conversation. But for the moment, I do want to focus on the substance. So right now, we're not going to talk about anything other than what you and Eric are on record saying about the relevant math and physics. In one instance that I'll get to, Eric is on record saying different things in 2021 than he said before 2021, but his 2021 statements, as far as I can tell, are consistent, and I will assume those are his current views. I'm going to base any of my descriptions of your arguments on quotes from your paper and on your podcast interviews. And as I said to you just a second ago, I do not understand what the terms mean. And I want you to correct me if I mischaracterize you and to add anything if you think it'd be helpful. Finally, to those watching, if you're not interested in the math and physics substance, you can skip ahead in the timestamps. Okay, so let's start with what geometric unity is. In April of this year, Joe Rogan asked Eric what geometric unity is, and Eric replied, quote, "This is the hardest thing for me to say because I have to not hedge it. I think it's the theory of everything," unquote. Okay, so that raises the question, what is a theory of everything?
Well, actually, I forgot he said it actually so directly like that, which is actually quite surprising given the fact that he prefaces his paper with, the disclaimer at the very bottom of the first page, which is that Eric Weinstein is, he says that I am, he's an entertainer, not a physicist. I'm actually very curious why Joe Rogan didn't push him on that. Like, what is this disclaimer about? Because I think all of us are very curious to know. But anyways, back to your actual question, what is the theory of everything? So in the context of physics, a theory of everything in the way it is used, although not everyone agrees. For example, Brian Keating doesn't seem to agree with this, but in the conventional sense in which a theory of everything is used, it would at minimum unify sort of 2 pillars of physics that we currently have, which are general relativity and quantum mechanics. And there's various forces that we have also in nature, so gravitation, electromagnetism, the strong force, and the weak force. And so a theory of everything would also unite those 4, along with classical general relativity and quantum mechanics. So that in a very brief nutshell would do those things, and Eric's theory falls well short of that.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because what I've heard you say, this is helpful for me. There's horizontal unification and vertical unification. Horizontal unification means unifying the 4 fundamental forces, gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak force, providing a coherent structure from which all 4 of those forces emerge. Vertical unification means reconciling all of those forces with quantum mechanics.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what have we achieved to date in the pursuit of a theory of everything defined that way?
Yeah. So I'm not going to be an expert in this particular question, but my understanding is, so there's in this sort of vertical versus horizontal, there's different ways you can sort of try to do unification, right? There's different ways these things are stratified. So, string theory is going to be the most ambitious of all of these, because string theory does predict a so-called graviton, which would account for gravity, and string theory does take into account quantum physics. And so should string theory work, whatever that means, it would be a candidate for theory of everything. Now, string theory has many of these other issues that I'm not, that qualified to speak about, but string theory is sort of, in some sense, I don't know about the best candidate, because that's kind of maybe a controversial term, but it is a candidate insofar as there isn't an obvious no-go that precludes it from the at least in trying to encompass the vertical and horizontal unification, as opposed to say loop quantum gravity, which is only trying to say quantized gravity and just ignore everything else out. So its scope is already narrowed down, right? And in fact, in Eric's case, he's only, despite what he tries to tell me about quantum physics, if you actually just look at the content or try to infer from the content, he's only doing this horizontal unification of trying to unite the forces. But yeah, I don't know what the current state is really. I mean, suffice it to say, we haven't achieved a theory of everything. Otherwise, someone would be very famous or rich or whatever. But yeah, there's still a lot to be done.
Okay, and tell me, I'm going to add a couple of things. So my understanding is that the standard model unifies three of the horizontal forces, electromagnetism and the strong and weak forces, and it also quantizes them.
That's right.
Right. So that's the standard model, the unification of electromagnetism, strong and weak, and then vertical unification with those three forces, and quantum field theory. And then we also have Einstein's theory of gravity. We don't have a satisfactory way of quantizing gravity. And have we also not unified gravity with the other three forces horizontally?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. So, right. And I've heard you say you could just, just to repeat what you just said, you could just try to make gravity quantum in isolation, and that would be like loop quantum gravity. You could go for horizontal unification, but not vertical. And that actually seems to be what Eric is attempting.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. And then you could try to unify everything horizontally and vertical, which is what string theory tries to do. And my understanding is that string theory, I think Robert Wright said this, is that it seems to be losing support in the physics community. I think maybe in part because it's unfalsifiable or something like that. But
yeah, I mean, there's many critics, but of course there's still many string theorists. So again, it depends who you ask. I don't have a dog in the fight, you know. But Sabina Hassenfeld is critical of string theory. Of course, Peter Wright has basically made his entire career out of being critical of string theory, and he has a nice blog keeping everyone up to date about his criticisms of string theory. But of course, there's still also a lot of string theorists. A person who I really respect, Sean Carroll, is pro string theory. So I think it's it's a very divided opinion. Yeah.
Okay, so my understanding is that you have two basic critiques of Weinstein in a very broad sense. First, he's overselling his theory. Geometric unity is not a theory of everything. It's not quantum. If it succeeded, it would only achieve horizontal unification. It would unify Einstein, Yang-Mills, which is so Einstein, which is gravity, Yang-Mills, which is electromagnetism, and the Dirac equations. I don't know how exactly Dirac relates to the strong and weak force, but in any case, he's not even trying to do vertical unification. And in that sense, it's not really a theory of everything, which I started off by saying, he says to Joe Rogan, this is the theory of everything. But I think your first critique is the way that term is standardly used implies quantizing gravity at a minimum. It implies vertical unification, and he's not even attempting that.
That's right. And it's also very inappropriate because, of course, Joe Rogan's not qualified to assess the physics. And so in that context, it's also very, very even more illegitimate because, Eric knows the audience, Joe Rogan, it's a lay audience. And to use a theory of everything so casually like that is to create another image or interpretation of who he is rather than really discussing about it in a proper scientific context.
And we'll get more into this kind of question later in the conversation, because I think it's possible that he really thinks it is the theory of everything and the mainstream information landscape just won't recognize it or is closed to the possibility. I'm not saying that's true, but I think it's possible. I don't know. I think it's possible that when he says that to Joe Rogan, he really believes it. He's not just taking advantage of the fact that he knows virtually no one in the audience has the capacity to contest that claim. But we'll get back to it.
Yeah. It's very, it is very unclear whether Eric's acting in bad faith or he's just misguided.
Yeah. Okay. But in any case, your first basic critique is he's overselling the theory. It's not quantum. It's only seeking horizontal unification. And that means it's not a theory of everything, as he at least claimed to Joe Rogan. And it does sound kind of absurd, as he claimed to Joe Rogan. It's like not as he proposed to like the annual conference of physicists. Or, so I'm aware of how kind of absurd this sounds. But okay, so now your second broad critique, and this is really the critique that is put forward in your paper, is that as a theory of horizontal unification, in its more limited aims, geometric unity is deeply flawed and incomplete. So you have 4 critiques, and what I'd like to do here is just ask you to kind of summarize. We're going to go one by one. I don't want you to summarize all 4 in a row. I want you to summarize them one by one, and then I might have some things to say about each. But yeah, I'm going to start each of the 4 by just asking you to summarize the critique. So how would you summarize your first critique, which I take to be, which you have said is the most important?
Yeah. So the way in which Eric tries to get this horizontal unification of the 4 forces is through an equation that's supposed to recover these various equations that are involved with the forces, Einstein's equations, the Yang-Mills equations, the Dirac equation. And so he writes down this equation, and this equation involves what's called this Cheab operator. In his video lecture, he very quickly and verbally defines the Cheab operator. And so that was the part where, I probably spent the most focus on trying to decipher that. And then when I finally did, I realized, oh, he's basically made a basic mathematical error. And because of that error, the equation doesn't make any sense. And if the equation doesn't make any sense, then nothing downstream makes any sense. And and since everything is so vague what he asserts, there's no obvious way to fix it. His entire video is already quite vague, and of course, even if it weren't that vague, as any professional scientist knows, when you go to a talk, things are just sketched out to motivate ideas. It's very hard to try to reconstruct the entirety of a theory purely from a talk. Right. So anyways, the whole thing is very vague. And of course, it doesn't help that he didn't write his paper very well. But this operator can't be defined. So his theory essentially collapsed because there's not enough details to fill in the vacuum created. And then his paper admits that he no longer knows how to construct this operator. So basically the theory hinges upon the definition of this operator. He can't define it. And so, his theory is doomed.
So I'm actually going to go into a little bit more detail just based on what you said. So you use his statements in the Oxford lecture and perhaps statements elsewhere online to define his Cheab operator to the extent that you can. And then having done this, you say that the operator has to be complexified, because if it isn't complexified, the theory is in mathematical or logical error. Sure. But if the Cheab operator were complexified, the physical, as distinct from the logical implications, would be pathological. That is, we would have to accept energy values ranging from positive to negative infinity. Basically, we'd have to throw out the principles of classical physics. We'd have to reformulate the strongly accepted foundations of physics. That's the more elaborate summary.
Yes.
Okay, so the reason I want to get that on the table is that Eric's response, I think, is that, like, to the extent that there is a response, his response, it seems to me, is this critique is valid. He actually said that to Joe Rogan. And so he concedes this point, as you noted. And as you further noted, he says that he lost the lecture notes and is no longer conversant in the relevant language, and therefore cannot reconstruct the operator or its derivations, but he hopes someone else can, or that he can reconstruct it at some point. And he tries to give the readers some tools for constructing the Cheab operators. So I think he, again, like this first basic critique, he actually is not saying it's wrong. He says it's true. Now, one thing I want to add is I think he suggests in his paper that this critique is not as significant as you make it out to be. So he writes, quote, the particulars of the Sheob operator are workmanlike and not of much interest. And I'll come back to this a little bit later, but I think, like, whereas you argue this is sort of a fatal flaw that discredits the entire theory, he thinks it's a more minor issue that could be overcome in the future. And I'm going to come back to that at the very end, because I think his broader critique of his critics is that they're quibbling, or they're shooting down the initial instantiation of an idea, right?
Right.
Even though the underlying idea might be true. So anyway, but can you just respond to what I've just said there? Is there anything you'd like to say?
I mean, how do I say? I mean, it's funny because I feel like many a mathematician, professional mathematicians are guilty of the phrase clearly, obviously, which is a very dangerous phrase because it can often mean that you didn't clearly think about your argument and you might actually have a flaw in it, right? So Eric's poetic rendition of this is workmanlike and not of much interest, it is something akin to that, maybe clearly, obviously, or basically I don't have sufficient energy to explicate details. Okay. Now, of course, this is subjective, but there are times when clearly is justified. There are times when it's not, right? It's of course up to the reader. And if Eric did have enough details to enable a sufficiently competent reader, or even himself, to reconstruct the details, that would be fine, right? The reason you omit details is to spare the reader tedium. You don't omit details so that others can fill them in for you when you haven't done so yourself, or you don't know what you're talking about, right? So I think based on all the context in which he's saying that, he's not saying that from I'm trying to although he does say it's workmanlike and not of much interest, he's doing it's more of a way of covering himself than a service to the reader. It's in that context, it's a disservice to the reader. In mathematics is has a huge body of knowledge and work, and so you usually omit details because it's quote unquote standard material that you can find in a textbook, or in the extreme case, it's become folk knowledge in the theory, in the literature among your colleagues, and it might not be written down, but people sort of accept it. This is very common in physics, where things are much less rigorous. But since Eric is trying to construct something anew, then it's even more the burden on him to supply the details, because he's the one trying to convince his critics. He's not an established mathematician who has built up a body of knowledge and people have this way of thinking that's aligned with Eric's. No, he's trying to convince the skeptics. And so insofar as he wants to do that and succeed, the burden is on him to supply the details. And if he doesn't do it, nobody else is going to.
Okay, so that's the first component of your critique, and I've tried to characterize his response that is on record, and then you gave your response to that. So let's move to the second one, your second argument.
Yeah, so it's actually, this one's kind of annoying because in the Clubhouse recording, and from what I've heard elsewhere, he keeps trying to say that our objection is that the theory is chiral, but that's not our objection. Our objection is that there's a chiral anomaly, and those are similar sounding phrases. There's a distinction. And so a chiral anomaly is what can happen when you try to do this vertical integration. You quantize the theory. And the problem is that this chiral anomaly becomes a gauge anomaly, whatever that means. And if you have this gauge anomaly, then by the accepted principles of quantum mechanics, that's a no-go. Okay. And so what we point out is that Eric has this gauge anomaly if he tries to quantize his theory. So, I mean, I guess he can avoid this critique if he doesn't want to quantize, but then he has no right to call his theory a theory of everything, right? So we're sort of pointing out the error if he were to quantize the theory. Yeah.
And in that sense, it is inferential, as he said to Rogan, right? Okay. I mean, so his response, I think, is a theory of everything doesn't have to be quantum. I'm not trying to make geometric unity quantum. You, Tim, are incorrectly inferring that I am.
Sure.
Now, I think if that's his position, he is implying that quantum theory is false, which was Einstein's intuition, if I'm not mistaken. Because if it were true, a theory of everything, which geometric unity is, according to Weinstein, would have to include it.
Yeah, I mean, how to say? I mean, as I sort of discussed on Bob's podcast, I'm describing our current understanding of physics, and nobody truly knows what the next few versions of fundamental physics will be like. I can only speak about what we know present day. So if Eric does want to throw out quantum physics, there's nothing fundamentally impossible about doing that. It's just that he'd create such a large vacuum. What would he replace it with? And that would be way out of scope with, that's an even much bigger program than geometric unity, right? So sort of the example I used was, if you're going to have a theory of biology and at some point your theory hits an impasse and you say, oh, this is where God comes in. Well, if you're going to invoke that, then you might as well just forget about your theory of biology and talk about the role of the supernatural and how God enters in. Like you've already invoked such a huge mysterious principle that why are you even wasting our time talking about biology when you really should be talking about God, right? So if Eric really wants to throw out quantum theory, he should be addressing that primarily, first, I would think, not just trying to smuggle it in to his geometric unity. And he also sort of, replies with such kind of animosity that it's hard to sort of take him seriously. I mean, I know we're going to character issues here, but what I'm saying is that if we really just inferred incorrectly, then okay, so he should just kind of state precisely what he's trying to do rather than just saying this is not what I'm doing. In other words, if we have a precise objection, then the way to dismantle that is to formulate it precisely and also state precisely what's different, not just say, oh, that's not what I'm doing, and just full stop. It's very opaque, right? So you don't learn anything when you say that's not what I'm doing. If I say, Santa Claus doesn't exist because reindeer doesn't fly, and your response is, well, I'm not using reindeer. Well, I mean, sort of, okay, so you haven't answered the question of so what animal are you using to fly the sled, right? So sort of, if you're going to give a response, this is not what you're doing, there's a vacuum that you have to replace. And each of his sort of rebuttals don't fill in that vacuum. So, I'm fine if argument 2 is not what he's doing. He hasn't explained it in a way that, okay, so what are you doing, right? Which is the big question.
Okay, so moving along, your third argument. Let me say one thing before you get to the third argument, which is this is the area where Eric, what he says in 2021 is different from what he said before. So let me just clarify that before you give your critique. But, and this is part of the reason why it seems to me, Eric read your paper and wrote his paper with your critiques in mind to shield himself against them. That's, okay. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, if you don't think that, it's pure speculation, but it just seems coincidental. I'll get to why that seems to me to be true, but actually getting ahead of myself. Right now, we're just talking about the substance, but I just want to make clear that with respect to your third argument, the subject of which is supersymmetry, Eric's initial argument before 2021, he said multiple times that geometric unity does use supersymmetry. So in his 2013 Oxford lecture, he said it uses a quote, supersymmetric extension to the inhomogeneous gauge group. And then in his appearance on Brian Keating's podcast in August of 2020, he said his theory uses supersymmetry. But his more recent argument, so like now in 2021, Eric, I think, is saying that he is not using supersymmetry. And that's from his paper, the paper that he released in April of 2021 on Joe Rogan's podcast. So yeah, there's a passage on page 60 and a footnote. And I think it implies that geometric unity does not make significant use of supersymmetry. And also on Joe Rogan's show, I think when he said 2 of your critiques are inferential, meaning they're assuming he's trying to do something that he's not, he was implying there that his theory is not using supersymmetry.
Right. Yeah.
So in other words, he suggested before 2021, he implied before 2021 that geometric unity does use supersymmetry. From April 1st onward, his position is that he's not using supersymmetry. But you wrote your paper based on the videos in which he said he is using supersymmetry. And so your critique is related to, it's like, if you're using supersymmetry, this problem arises. Go ahead.
That's right. Yeah. And so, yeah. And I should say, yeah, thankful, what was, in some ways, what's convenient about the video is that it's very easy to timestamp exactly what he says, where he says it, as opposed to like the usual textual citations where you have to actually, download, scroll. So in some sense, there are benefits to video format in kind of a funny way. But yeah, so of course, you're reading the timestamps that we use, and our paper is filled with them because that's the only way we could cite his work. So in our paper, we cite the places where he says he uses supersymmetry, and then of course, come 2021 when he releases his paper, he says he's not using it. So, but again, it's sort of the same issue where if you're not doing it, then what did you mean when you said it in 2020, and what do you mean when you say you don't use supersymmetry in your paper? And his paper is very, poorly written. So the whole thing is, again, this kind of funny thing where, he denies things, but he doesn't fill in the vacuum of sort of what he's doing, which is very frustrating, obviously, and it comes off as very disingenuous. But in terms of the actual substance of the argument, the point is that, he's working in 14 dimensions. If you invoke supersymmetry in 14 dimensions, there's various consequences to that lead to, various pathologies, let's say. And so if he's going to, and so that's the consequence of using supersymmetry in 14 dimensions. And it seems from the way GU is constructed, he's just not even aware of all these issues. And so that was our objection. Yeah.
Right. I mean, maybe there's no point in my going into the detail about what I wrote about this. I didn't do that for your second argument, but yeah, I have written here that you argue that if geometric unity does extend supersymmetry to inhomogeneous gauge groups, there is an infinite sector of fields, which is inconsistent with geometric unity's proposed gauge groups, U128 or spin 14, something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Like those gauge groups could at best be subgroups of the infinite dimensional structure supergroup.
Yeah.
I don't know if that means anything to any viewers.
Yeah. I mean, basically, there's a lot of basically baggage that comes along with the Wright if you're going to use supersymmetry. And so, given the minimal description that Eric has given, it's clear that he hasn't taken into account of all that additional baggage. And so that's what we point out.
Okay, but again, since we're trying our best to stick to the substance, your first critique is that the Sheab operator, if it isn't complexified, leads to logical error. If it is complexified, it leads to pathological physics. Eric concedes that critique. Your second critique is, let me go back to it so I don't mungle. Your second critique is that basically geometric unity cannot be quantized. And Eric's response is, you're inferring that I'm trying to quantize, and I'm not. Your third critique is geometric unity cannot use supersymmetry, at least in the way he said, cannot extend supersymmetry to inhomogeneous gauge groups. And his response, again, from 2021 onward, is, I'm not trying to extend supersymmetry to homogeneous gauge groups. And then finally, your fourth critique.
Yeah, which is just to point out certain technical details which he states and doesn't back up. So actually, in the Joe Rogan episode, he says there were 3 objections. There were actually 4. And this is the 4th one, which is that he left out some details. And we just kind of isolated various places where he said certain things like the signs working out and something being exact, which is a mathematical term. So these are things that you just don't assert. You actually have to check these things. And so we just highlighted that for the convenience of the reader and the watcher. Places in the video where he asserts something that if you're an honest mathematician and scientist, you need to do your homework to check those things.
As far as I can tell, he has not responded to this 4th critique. He doesn't mention it to Rogan.
I've never even heard it. Yeah, I mean, in some sense, he does say that his paper is a draft. We want to be very charitable. If that's implicit, if that's an implicit response in the sense of, okay, since it's a draft, yeah, I don't have all the details. Fine.
Right. I was thinking that's a hard argument to respond to because it doesn't cite the presence of a problem. It cites the absence of various things that are needed. It would take like a lot more work to deal with that.
That's right.
I think I could be wrong, but he may have said something very briefly in Clubhouse about one thing related to your 4th critique, but I might be wrong there. Like I think he used the word sign at some point, but I could, it doesn't matter. Basically, he has not responded to your fourth critique, which is a different kind of critique. It's saying there are all these insufficiencies and inexactitudes, and
that's right.
You know, you would need to fill them in. And again, that's like, that's a
right.
hard thing to respond to. It's much easier to say, I'm not using supersymmetry. I'm not trying to make the theory quantum, but it's much easier to say that than to say, oh, I've got answers to all of these inexactitudes and incomplete parts. Okay, so in summary, he has kind of official responses, however superficially delivered to your first three critiques, but not to your fourth. Backing up, you have two broad critiques. He oversells geometric unity as a theory of everything. That's the first one. And then the second one is, in its more limited aims, geometric unity is deeply flawed and incomplete. Okay, so the last thing I want to say substantively is Eric has one more response that is broader, but I think important to him. I want to characterize it and then get your thoughts on it. This is going to take me a couple of minutes to characterize. So he says that the first instantiations of a great idea are always wrong. We should focus on the underlying idea, not the particular instantiation of it. The quote, mainstream of the community of professional physicists, this is Weinstein, does not do this. They focus on the instantiation, prove it wrong experimentally or otherwise, and discard the theory. I think he thinks that that's what you are doing, Tim. You're proving this instantiation of Eric's idea wrong. I think he would say, my instantiation is wrong. In fact, on Rogan, he said there will be errors. But the underlying idea is right, in his view. And to support this view, he states that Einstein, Schrodinger, and Dirac got the first instantiations of their ideas wrong, but their underlying ideas ultimately proved right. I'm going to read a quote from his paper. Quote, one should search for a theory that is geometrically and algebraically natural and quite close to our world at a stylistic level. If such a theory can be found, it is our historically well-motivated but partially unjustified belief that initial instantiations will be confounded by difficulties that are likely to prove inessential and thus surmountable. So I think Eric would say the problems that you're pointing to are likely to prove inessential and surmountable. Here's a related quote from his Rogan appearance. Quote, the paper is for experts, and they're going to have their day with it, and they're going to be angry and mean, and that's going to happen. But at the end of that process, hopefully the ideas herein contained, pointing to his paper, could change the world. It's the first time I've ever seen somebody tell a complete story about how did this place fill up with all this crazy stuff, assuming almost nothing to begin with, unquote. So I think he thinks that you, Tim, are one of the experts who is being angry and mean. Finally, on the Brian Keating show, he said, there is a role for critics and for people who always say, show me the evidence or cite every flaw, but often those people are wrong. And the irresponsible scientists, that's his term, are right. For example, he says, a lot of people said that Watson and Crick were barking up the wrong tree. They had insufficient evidence. Rosalind Franklin is one example of people who said this, but they were wrong and Watson and Crick were right. So in short, his view is that if you knock down the initial instantiations of an idea and therefore discard the underlying idea, you impede progress in physics. It's a small and uncharitable way to do physics. What is more, the stakes are now existential as we have to get out of the solar system. So I think I've faithfully characterized one last view that Eric takes about all this. So what do you say to that?
Sure. So I think, how should I best respond? I think it's conflating things in a bad faith way in the following sense, for every Galileo that's persecuted, right, there's going to be thousands of people that are just wrong and not Galileo, right? So, and furthermore, there's this saying, I think it was due to Planck, and I actually mentioned this quote to Eric in our Discord conversation, because I think I didn't know who the quote came from, and then Eric actually corrected me saying where it came from. So there's a saying by Planck that says that, roughly says that the only way for a new theory to take foothold is when the supporters of the old theory die off, right?
Funeral by funeral science.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, that says many things, right? It already illustrates to you, for example, that scientists are human too. They have biases. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, things like that. But sort of in this context, it also shows you that new theories are always going to be radical. There's always going to be pushback, right? Because if it wasn't shocking or surprising or upsetting, it wouldn't be a radical theory, right? When Einstein's special theory of relativity and general theory of relativity came out, they were also treated with skepticism. He wasn't vindicated. It was only when there was an eclipse in 1919 and the various observations that were made then that vindicated his theory. Right, he became an overnight celebrity by dethroning Newtonian physics, conclusively in that experiment. So it's not surprising that revolutionary ideas have pushed back and people have tried to squelch them. But that's confusing the direction of causality. So a great idea will have critics, but that doesn't mean that because you have critics that your idea is great, right? So for every great idea, there's going to be 1,000, if not more, bad ideas. So in the sense that I'm saying Eric is disingenuous, he's sort of using a lot of truthful observations about the flaws of human behavior, of groupthink, in trying to resist revolutionary ideas, and those criticisms are valid. He said that he's misapplying it to himself to diminish the criticisms of his work. So in other words, by highlighting the difficulties that revolutionary thinkers had to go through, without also remarking the disclaimer that for every great idea there's 1,000 bad ideas, he's sort of trying to convince the reader that that his cause of criticism is because he's great, not because of the more mundane causes of criticism. And by not addressing those, criticisms, it's hard to believe, if you have the technical background to assess the work, to see why Eric thinks that the kind of treatment he's getting is on par with the treatment that people who have revolutionary ideas have received. So yeah, it's just he's misapplying these sorts of sociological phenomenon to himself. So the analysis is correct, but it doesn't apply to him. Let's
gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So at this point, we've gone through the substantive portion. We've said everything about the substantive math and physics, what you have said, what I think Eric would say in response. And now we're going to move into actually what I intended to be the meat of our conversation. So I want to pivot now and just very briefly do what I'm calling a subjective chronology. So we're moving away from the substantive disagreement and talking about other matters. So you were initially a fan of Eric's content in 2020. A colleague, as we mentioned, a colleague at Google turned you on to him, knowing that you didn't have a great experience in academia. That's something you had in common with Eric Weinstein. Furthermore, Eric Weinstein is a mathematician with interest in physics. So you consume some of his content. He does know a lot of physics. He's verbally absorbing. I don't think anyone can deny that. He's had interesting conversations with physicists, many of them very well established. So you and some others like Garrett Lisi, who's kind of more off on his own. But in any case, so you were initially a fan of his content. That's my point, in like 2020. But that changed and you started to become skeptical. And I think that the key event that led to your changing view of him or your increased skepticism of him are these two conversations you had on a Discord server for the portal in late August and early September of 2020. So can you tell us the story of what led you from being a fan to a little more skeptical and how you came to write the paper?
Yeah. So basically, yeah, I mean, the two main aspects of our meeting that I want to highlight, and which I've highlighted elsewhere, is the fact that, I asked him a technical question about the Seibert-Witten equations, and he failed to answer them to the degree that I would expect someone who claims to have discovered them could answer them. And then also just sort of his general behavior around his fans. When I first arrived at the first chat session in the Discord, he kind of early on started off the session by asking this technical question in gauge theory. In fact, it's actually the problem that's in the one lemma in our paper was actually the problem that he posed. I think there's something about bundles, okay? And, he posed it, it's not that hard to solve conceptually if you have a PhD in mathematics and the right kind of gauge theory background. So I thought about it for 30 seconds and then I answered it. And then that's how I got some attention, because then it's like, okay, who is this Tim guy? I introduced myself, went to MIT, he knew my advisor. So just that question itself was kind of strange. But then I think now that I think about it, it was either preceded or the discussion thereafter. He would keep going on and talking about, the Yang-Mills equations and give sort of analogies about the various elements that go into gauge theory, like the covariant derivative. And it was all just very strange because, I didn't see what the point of him talking about gauge theory, which is a difficult subject to these people who don't have the requisite training, while at the same time claiming to have a theory of everything. If he were very serious about having a theory of everything, he should be busy writing it down or talking to people that are at his level. Why is he squandering his time if not just to impress people, right?
And responding so heatedly to the one paper that actually does engage the substance.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, and then can you say a little bit more about how you came to write the paper? So that made you more skeptical, but you published the paper, I don't know, several months after that. Half a year
after the second meeting, which was in early September, I was just I was very disappointed. And then that's also where I got introduced to a group of people that I'm still in touch with, Theo Polya and others, because they saw that, hey, here's a guy who knows math physics, and we're also basically skeptical of Eric. Why don't you let's keep in touch. And so Eric actually does have quite a group of people that found him and then became skeptical, right? So Theo Polya is one of the other ones, and also Dan Gilbert, who was also one of the people on the Decoding the Gurus podcast. Anyways, so I kind of lost interest in Eric afterwards. I think I tried to maybe catch him for a third time, but I don't know if this is coincidence or due to me, but he started appearing on the voice chats very much less often afterwards. I would like to think it's because he maybe realized he was not going to survive further encounters with me, but it could just be purely coincidence. But anyways, I failed to talk to him a few more times. I don't think I tried as hard, but I think Eric didn't try as hard. After those two, I did try to ping some of his loyal disciples about, hey, Eric did say that we were going to host discussions about geometric unity, and those never materialized, and his disciples never got back to me. So anyways, myself and other people realized Eric's not serious about his geometric unity, which is also why we never thought he was going to write it up, because he wasn't willing to engage at all in any serious discussion. Anyway, so I just kind of move on with my life. I stopped listening to his podcast. I'm like, wait, this guy's just not serious. I can't take this guy seriously anymore. And then he basically just drops off my radar for a few months. It wasn't until this was sometime around December where Dan Gilbert went on the Decoding the Gurus podcast. And there was a bit of me that was sort of like, oh, wait, Dan was able to give a very good criticism of Eric's ways on the Discord server, just going much deeper into sort of the theatrics that I just highlighted. And then it made me realize, well, if this is a legitimate way of calling somebody out or expressing valid critique, then I feel that certainly I have the capacity to do it at a much higher and unique level, given what happened and my unique position to comment upon the Seibert-Witten equations. So that was part of it. And so Dan, Theo Polya, and I we're all, online friends in this regard. And then I think I just started talking to Theo Polya about, okay, so Dan released his content. Maybe there's something we can do as well, just because, quite frankly, we were kind of irritated with Eric about going around his promoting GU, Brian Keating's podcast and whatnot, really, puffing up and posturing that he has this great theory. But, when we meet him on the Discord, he's not he says he's interested in engaging, but he doesn't engage at all. So we found this huge sort of like disconnect between what he says and how whether he actually follows up. So in some sense, we basically said, okay, we kind of got tired of seeing this bad behavior, basically, and after we decided about, okay, so how are we going to get out our critique, we finally just decided, okay, you know what, let's write the paper. At first I actually wasn't resisting the idea of doing this, because I thought this is such a waste of time. Why would I want to watch this video and try to decipher it? It turns out it was the right thing to do, because I was one of the few people in the world who could actually decipher the video. But okay, so it just sort of naturally materialized. In other words, I wasn't out to write this paper at all. It's just that Dan, who was in my social circle, went on the Decoding Views podcast. He got some attention. I'm like, okay, well, just being human nature. Well, okay, so he got a bit of publicity. If that's the case, then maybe I should also follow up with that. And the paper idea just sort of came out naturally. It wasn't even my idea. I think it was Theo's idea. But then the fact that I would have a co-author made made it more of a sustainable project. And so it ended up being over the course of that late December to late February, when we released our paper, we met like twice a week for about an hour, just kind of, okay, what did you understand in the video? Let's compare notes. And the first undoing was eventually when I parsed the Shia operator was a no-go, and then things just started piling up from there. And then we wrote our paper, and okay, and then the rest is history. And here we are.
Sounds fun. I mean, the paper writing process. I don't do much collaboration personally, but the way you just described that experience, meeting to talk, sounds fun actually. Okay, so okay, so I just want to make a quick point here, and this may be unimportant, but okay, so after you publish your paper, first, we know that Eric read your paper before publishing his paper. We know this because he published his paper while on Joe Rogan's podcast on April 1st, 2nd, 2021. And in that conversation, Joe asked him what the criticism of geometric unity had been. And Eric said there had been one critique, and it became clear he was referring to your paper. And furthermore, he characterized the objection. So we know he read it. We also know that in his paper, Eric added new content and removed old content. It seems to me, for what it's worth, that Eric made revisions in response to your critiques. I'm thinking of two examples in particular. First, the Shia operator. So in his Oxford lecture in 2013 and in his 2020 YouTube video, he did not mention that he no longer has the details of the Shia operator or of its derivation. But in his paper in 2021, he does mention this. He states on page 42 that he doesn't have the operator and derivation details, but hopes he can reconstruct them or that someone else can. Second example, supersymmetry. As I already mentioned, before 2021, Eric said multiple times that geometric unity does use supersymmetry, but in his 2021 paper, he says that he is not using supersymmetry. And on Rogan in 2021, he implies that it was an inferential error on your part, Tim, to assume that he was using supersymmetry. So it seems to me that Eric read your rebuttal before publishing his paper and revised his paper in response to your critiques. Before we go any further, because I have more to say, but before we go any further, do you agree with that? It's obviously speculative, but if you had to guess, would you guess that he read it and made changes?
Yeah, I don't know if he necessarily. Yeah, to be honest, I haven't given that much thought, just because, quite frankly, the quality of the paper was so poor that in another universe in which we never wrote our rebuttal, it would still be of poor quality. You know what I'm saying? So it was just like, it's sort of like asking an author, okay, so I don't know, you have 20 drafts of your huge volume. Is this draft number 2 or draft number 3? Like, okay, it's just so far removed from anything that's polished that I didn't give it much thought. He doesn't cite our work, which was a very disappointing.
I'm gonna get to that.
Okay, yeah. So actually, to be honest, I haven't given much thought about it. It's not as interesting as many of the other kind of issues or controversy. It's certainly possible. I mean, it's probably more likely that he revised it than didn't revise it. But yeah, I don't have a strong opinion about this, to be honest.
Well, again, it's like, okay, so otherwise, what would explain why he dropped supersymmetry? What would explain why he adds details about the Sheehan operator? You know, if it's like, if you had never written that rebuttal, I wonder if those parts of his paper would be there.
Yeah, but although the thing is that Eric is so, how do I say, he did such an about face with his release in terms of, this disclaimer, entertainer, not a physicist, that if he was willing to go that low, like, there's a part of me that's like, maybe he would have done that disclaimer anyways, where there was no rebuttal. I don't know, like, how do I say, like, if he's so convinced about his theory that no matter what criticism he gets, he still has belief in his theory, then how he qualifies or disqualifies himself should be independent. Like, in other words, if you're so stubborn, how you treat your work and yourself will be sort of relatively independent to what other people say. So in a world in which he didn't get the criticism, like, maybe he still have the disclaimer, but just have some slight other details. I don't know, but I'm just saying that I think the overall quality of the work, which is quite poor, would be a persistent feature, regardless of our critique.
Well,
I don't.
If he did that is, if he read your paper and revised his in response to it, that makes not citing you a more unethical decision. It's like, if that paper had no effect on his thinking, then he has no obligation to cite you, right? But if he read it, revised the paper, and then didn't cite you, that's questionable, in my opinion. So we can leave open the question whether Eric actually revised his paper in response to your rebuttal. We know that he read your rebuttal.
Yeah, actually, to be honest, I was actually surprised he even released it, because I didn't think. Yeah, actually, so there was this period of a few weeks between our release and the April 1st release. It's like, so is Eric actually going to now release the paper or not? Because that's why it was so fortuitous that our paper came out right after the Lex Fridman thing, because he basically publicly committed to releasing it. So not releasing on April 1st would be a silent admission that something's wrong, right? So it wasn't clear to us if he was still going to do that or not. In some sense, I think this would have turned out better for Eric had he just not released it and say, you know what, I need to think things over. I found some problems. And he doesn't even have to say that there are problems. He just said, they could just be that he found his own problems, right? But he decided to release it anyways in the form that it is. Yeah.
Okay, so now I want to get into a fairly long section of this conversation regarding Eric's statements about you. So, okay, so I gave my point of view, and I'm not dogmatic about this, obviously, but my assessment was that he did revise in response to your rebuttal, but I can't prove that, and I could be wrong. Now, what has Eric said about you? Well, he has not cited you. He has not talked to you since your Discord conversations in the fall of 2020. He has only acknowledged your work twice in public, and in both cases, it was because someone asked him about your work. He would not have brought it up himself. The first person who brought it up was Joe Rogan on April 1st, 2021. The second was this math professor named Joseph on Clubhouse on May 16th, 2021. Okay, now what did Eric say on those two occasions when people brought up your work? He didn't say much on Rogan. He said a lot more on Clubhouse. In both cases, though, it was a mix of ad hominem arguments and substantive arguments, however brief. There was also an ironic appeal to authority. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time going through what he said because I think it's important. I'm going to be pretty critical of both Eric and Brian Keating, but I hope not unfairly. So on Rogan asked Eric, what's been the criticism of geometric unity? And Eric made one ad hominem argument. He said, I refuse to deal with an anonymous coward, referring to the pseudonymous Theopolia. And then he briefly outlined his substantive response, which is, they came up with three criticisms. Two are inferential, referring to the supersymmetry and the quantizing critiques. That is, so he says they came up with three criticisms. Two are inferential, referring to your second and third critiques. They imagine I'm doing something I'm not doing. And then one of the critiques is valid, but it's something I would have brought up anyway. There he's referring to the Sheehan operator. And I think he may have that. I guess my take was he saw your critique and then he's like, I need to bring this up. And he put it in his paper. But again, I could be wrong. Okay, so that's what he said on Rogan. Now he said a lot more on Clubhouse, and he was with Brian Keating, the UCSD astrophysicist and YouTube show host. So Brian Keating and Eric were co-hosting a conversation on Clubhouse. This is mid-May 2021. The conversation is entitled, "Let's Talk About Physics." A math professor in this chat named Joseph asks Eric, "When are we going to hear a debate between you and Theo and Tim?" Okay, now in response, a heated exchange results, which many will know, many will not know about, if you're not following the story as closely as I am. But a heated exchange results between this math professor named Joseph and Eric. Again, the math professor asked Eric, "When are we going to hear a debate between you and Theo and Tim?" Okay, now I'm not going to I might play this in the actual video. I might play the segment, but I'm just going to characterize the things Eric said and the things that Brian said in the conversation that resulted. So Eric made a lot of ad hominem arguments. He said, again, "I will not engage with an anonymous critic." So the anonymity issue we brought up again. He said, too, "There's a Discord server that supports these people," referring to you and Theo, I think. "And the people on that server have said a lot of terrible things. They've said that the rebuttal is going to make Eric cry. They've threatened Eric's family. They've been, this is according to Eric, they've been misogynistic and made rape jokes. They've misgendered people. These are sick people. These are freakish people." That's what Eric said. These people on the Discord server that supports Theo and Tim, according to Eric. Okay, third, Eric repeatedly says that you, Tim, I think he's implying that you and maybe Theopolia are trying to make a name for yourself, to get Eric to name you, to get on major podcasts like Rogan and Lex Friedman. And he also said you tried to get out in front of this paper, like kind of reading your intentions. Okay, so those are all the ad hominem arguments that Eric made in that conversation. He also made one appeal to authority. Archive, as I mentioned earlier, is this free distribution service and open access archive where scholars can post scientific papers. Often scholars post on Archive to claim an idea before anyone else does. Eric said on Clubhouse, there wasn't a paper put out rebutting geometric unity. There was an attempt to publish something on Archive, which was rejected, that attempted to get out in front of the draft I put out. So according to Eric, there wasn't a paper put out. There was an attempt to put a paper out and Archive rejected it. First of all, this is me editorializing. A paper was put out, just not on Archive. Okay.
Exactly.
Right. Second, what does it matter if a particular institution rejected it? That doesn't mean it isn't good. No one should be more sympathetic to that claim than Eric. Okay.
Exactly. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Eric made a few brief substantive claims too. He said, you guessed he had a chiral theory. It's not a chiral theory. Your response to that is, I didn't say it was a chiral theory. I'm saying if he quantizes, there is a chiral anomaly. But in any case, he said you asserted that he was going to bring space-time supersymmetry in 14 dimensions, right? So the inferential error about supersymmetry. He said you tried to cast aspersions on the fact that there's non-compact groups involved, which come naturally from spin 1,3. I have no idea what that means. Maybe it doesn't matter. We don't have to get into it. Okay, so having gone through that, I'm going to add that, in my opinion, Eric bullied Joseph on Clubhouse, talking over him, repeatedly telling him, "You're not understanding," even though there's nothing that Eric was articulating that Joseph didn't understand. Eric began to descend into Mad King territory when he muted Joseph. Joseph had a very simple point that Eric was not acknowledging, namely that arguments are good or bad, regardless of who makes them. So if Hitler or Stalin quantized gravity, we wouldn't throw away their theory.
That's right.
Yeah. So Joseph wanted to know if Eric had a rebuttal of Tim and Theo's rebuttal. He was interested in the math and physics content and wanted to bracket questions of Tim and Theo's character. It was very clear. So now I want to bring in Brian Keating, who co-hosted this conversation and was present throughout. So the first thing I'll say is that he redirected the conversation with a non sequitur. So after the main part of Eric and Joseph's argument, Brian steps in and says, the title of this Clubhouse conversation is "Let's Talk About Physics," and suggested the participants focus on substance, not squabbles. But your and Theo's rebuttal is substantive, and all Joseph wanted was Eric's rebuttal of your rebuttal. Eric was the one failing to stick to the substance. Second, Brian Keating backed Eric's ad hominem arguments. First, he implicitly agreed with Eric that Eric does not need to engage with your rebuttal because one of the authors is anonymous. So during the bullying section of the conversation, Eric rhetorically asked Joseph, "Sorry, who's Theopolia? Who's Theopolia?" And Brian chimed in with a light tone, "Yeah, we don't know who he is. We have to know who he is." So Brian was kind of seconding Eric's argument that because one of the authors is anonymous, you don't have to engage with the rebuttal. Then Brian agreed, and I want you to respond to this, that you, Tim and Theo, are trying to make a name for yourself. So he said, I'll quote him, "Here's what happened, because they actually contacted me and they tried to troll me into it, and Lex Friedman into it, and they copied us, and Joe Rogan was involved. They wanted to get on all of our podcasts," unquote. So I think Brian Keating is saying here that, again, it's like you're trying to make a name for yourself. What is he referring to here? Is there anything you'd like to say in response to that?
Yeah, so that response was very disappointing. So let me go chronologically. After maybe about 2 or 3 weeks after our release, so we wrote a paper. Then there was the Sabine blog post, and then interestingly enough, the day that I released that, I think I might have tagged Brian on Twitter. Then he briefly followed me. I don't know. At some point, he unfriended me, but he followed me for a while on Twitter, maybe not knowing the full context of who I was or what was going on. Then what happened? Then we had this Q&A session on Discord, sort of our first live public discussion, Theopolia and I. And that was over a weekend. And then it was basically right after that event that I sent a very polite email to Brian saying, hey, Brian, maybe you've heard about our paper release through Sabine's blog. We'd be happy to discuss the work with you, possibly with Eric, either privately or publicly. Okay. So I did reach out to him, but I didn't presume that he would necessarily want us on his podcast. That should be his choice. Yeah.
Well, and he said they tried to troll me into it, which is that's really a critique of your character, and it's a statement about your intention. So I just want to note that, but continue.
Yeah. It's also very strange because he's almost trying to imply that he was never involved in the thing when in fact he's the main academic and scientist promoting GU in the first place. Right. So he is the person who's the biggest accomplice in the promotion of GU. So that's kind of a strange way to phrase it, trying to absolve himself. But anyways, to continue the story, of course, I wouldn't, how I say, there's of course a chance that Brian could have or should have considered me on his podcast. Theo wasn't interested. He wanted to remain anonymous. It would have been just me had Brian accepted. But I emailed Brian very courteously, as anyone emailing a professor they never met would, and I left it in his court how he wanted to respond. And I thought he would respond just because of how much he's invested into it. And yeah, like I said, I want to emphasize that I emailed it in the form of let's talk, on whatever terms basically you want, because who am I to assume that he would be interested in the podcast? But I thought he would at least be interested in the work, right? And then I didn't hear back whatsoever. So that was very disappointing. And but what can I do about it? I just didn't hear back, right? And so it was actually very disappointing when on April 1st, I actually wasn't even at that point. I wasn't even thinking about the work that much anymore. I was just having a work day. And then it wasn't until my friend said, "Hey, the live stream's happening with Brian Keating and Eric," that I tuned in and dropped everything I was doing. I even missed my physical therapy appointment that day because I was so zoned in. I wasn't even thinking, about this, planning my day towards it. Just happened. And then I was really disappointed that day because, as you saw on the episode, they just dismissed our work and said, anonymous troll, right? And I was like, wait a minute. So that's why he didn't want to get back to me, because, they wanted just to kind of discredit us and not give us a voice. So that was very disappointing. Regarding the Lex and Joe Rogan. So I don't even know why they assumed I reached out to Joe Rogan. I don't even know how I would reach out to Joe Rogan. I tagged Joe Rogan, I think in probably one of the tweets, but I tagged him. I never reached out to him. I don't even know how I would. Lex is a more interesting story, and this I haven't revealed just because there wasn't a need to. But actually, since you're asking it, I don't want to dodge the question. Theo actually knew Lex from before, in some capacity. I don't know quite the details. Lex has a much bigger profile than he did, I don't know, let's say 2 years ago, whenever they first met. I mean, he was still a podcaster back then, but not to the level that he is now. Actually, a funny thing happened. I think we announced our Q&A on like a Thursday for a Sunday event. And then Lex kind of absentmindedly thought that the Q&A was Thursday, not Sunday. And then he shows up on the Discord on accident. And that sort of kind of revealed to us that he was interested in our work, and it probably tipped off to Eric that Lex is in on this, right? So anyway, so Lex shows up by accident, and so Theo gets back in touch with them. Hey, we should talk. And so we arranged a 3-way GVC, okay, with Lex. Okay, so whether you call that me reaching out to him or whatnot, it's just that Theo already knew Lex, and so we had a 3-way chat. And again, how I say, who are we to dictate the terms of what Lex should do, right? I mean, right? So we just talked to Lex, we explained who, he already knows Theo, but he hadn't met me before. And it was nice to chat with Lex. We both have MIT and Google in common. Lex was an intern at Google at some point. We're both interested in AI. We chat, and it was a similar thing where, okay, Eric, you've interviewed him 4 times about various things, including geometric unity. Why don't you get in touch with Eric and ask him if he would be interested in talking with us either privately or publicly, right? Again, it's up to Lex to decide whether he wants to platform us or not. And he said he would get back to Eric. Well, the outcome was disappointing. He got back to us and basically, I don't remember the full details of the email, which I probably wouldn't want to go to anyways, but the long story short was he didn't want to have anything to do with hosting the conversation for whatever reason. If I had to guess, it's because I think some combination of, Eric bad-mouthing us and / it would look bad for Eric to shoot down his own star after having had him on many times. But the outcome was basically Lex wanted to absolve himself of controversy. And I think that's consistent with Lex's style. He's not about controversy. He's more about the, what do you love and what's the meaning of life kind of shtick, right? So right? So given that that's Lex's shtick, and given that he probably also doesn't want to sabotage anything with Eric, then he just basically said, I'm not down with this, basically, in his own language, just inferentially at least. I forgot exactly what he said. And then so that was also very disappointing because it would have been exciting to be on Lex's show. I'm not going to deny that. I don't see why I should be ashamed of admitting that it would be cool to be on Joe Rogan or Lex's podcast. Would anybody decline that opportunity? I mean,
nor is it bad to want to be on those podcasts.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, there are unethical and ethical ways of trying to get on those podcasts, but it's not bad to want to be on them.
That's right. I see some Reddit trolls that think that this is something shameful. I think it probably says more about them than it does about me, that they think it's a bad thing to try to podcast. But let's also say, look, I say, just to linger on this point, if you put out something of value in the world and you get on a podcast because of it, that's fine, right? And because you introduce value. It's not like I'm trying to get on there illegitimately by saying false things or creating drama where there is no drama. It's like, look, there is this drama that Brian Keating and Eric are partaking in. I responded, and
I mean, in my view, you've done something valuable for reasons I'll get to. Okay. Also, I was going to say, take solace in the fact that you are appearing on this show.
Thank you. Yeah. So in terms of things have worked out, but the fact is, this thing could have been shut down in another universe because Lex wasn't interested in, that's Lex's judgment, and Brian wasn't going to platform us. So we're going to get to the disc at some point. You could interpret whatever you wanted, but basically, look, we got shut down by the archive. Brian shut us down. Lex, I don't want to say he shut us down, but he wasn't interested, right? And to get back to your original question, I don't know where Brian got the idea or knowledge that we reached out to both Joe and Lex. If I had to infer, maybe Eric tried to badmouth this and plant seeds into Brian's mind, which is consistent with him calling Theo a troll and whatnot. But anyways, so I tagged Joe Rogan. Theo and I did talk to Lex, so that was not successful. So that sort of rounds out sort of who did we reach out to and what happened. So to summarize, Brian shot us down. Lex wasn't interested. I've never communicated with Joe Rogan other than a Twitter tag, and apparently Joe Rogan doesn't read comments anyway, so that was pretty futile. Yeah, so I hope I answered
Rogan would not be able to get through a single day if you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you for, as you say, like not dodging that question. One further thing I'll say about Brian Keating is that also in the Clubhouse conversation, he pointed out correctly, and I'm paraphrasing, that after Joseph asked Eric when he would debate Tim and Theo, Eric became very defensive. His limbic system overrode his prefrontal cortex. He lost the ability to engage in productive dialogue. That was obvious to everyone, I think, or anyone watching. Also obvious, though, was that Joseph was not being antagonistic. So I just wanted to point that out. Again, that's my opinion. One last thing related to Brian Keating. So I learned about him while researching your story. I was not aware of him. And I subscribed to his YouTube channel because I wanted to see some of these conversations about theories of everything. And he emailed me to thank me for subscribing, and he said he would love to come on my show. I told him, because at that point I was in contact with you, I told him that I'd love to moderate a conversation between him and you, either about the breakdown between Eric and his critics, or about the substance of geometric unity, or just about science. And he was polite, but said he was not interested. So I just wanted to add that to the record. Okay, so that's where we are.
Yeah, actually,
sorry.
I don't want to sound like a mean person, but when we were working this out, because so just to maybe go slightly deeper, right? So I went on Bob Wright's show. You reached out to me, and then shortly after, Brian reached out to you. We tried to negotiate, again, in very open-ended, what I thought was open-ended and friendly terms. You were the moderator. I don't know exactly what you sent to Brian, but we said, if Brian had any questions for me, at least I communicated that to you, and whether, if you would, just talk about GU at a high level, not as an expert, of course, which he's not, but just, he's written his book, Losing the Nobel Prize, is about sort of the incentive and motivation structures of science. Surely he could comment about that, being Eric's friend, whatever. Again, very kind of open-ended in his court, and it was unfortunate that he wasn't willing to find any agreeable terms. And there was a part of me that was like, I thought about this in terms of like podcast karma, in the sense of, he shot, me down, and he tries to go on your podcast, and then he basically shoots himself down. So I don't know.
So here's a summary of this part of the conversation. So on the positive side, Joe Rogan brought up your rebuttal to Eric. That's cool. Like Joe Rogan Rogan read your work, I think.
Heard about it. Here's my hypothesis. Well, first of all, Joe Rogan says there has been criticism of this, right? So he didn't mention us specifically. He left it open, right, like there could be more than one. So it wasn't unique.
That's a good point.
It ended up being unique to us, but because we are the only ones. But my theory is that because I think Lex might have mentioned that. I forget now. I think he might have said, I don't know. And I feel bad that maybe I should have said this, but I think he might have suggested that he was going to talk to Joe Rogan about our work. I forget if he actually did say that, to be honest. So that's just now me just recollecting things. But if I had to guess, I think Joe might have learned it from Lex, because I'm pretty sure Joe did not
read it,
either read our paper or read Sabina Hassenfelder's blog. That I'm pretty sure. So I think he learned about it from Lex.
Right. Rogan is a man of many interests and passions, but to my knowledge, whatever the kind of physics you do is not one.
Yeah, that's right. But I'm glad you did bring it up. In many ways, if you look at the Reddit comments, Eric did not have a very good showing on Joe Rogan's podcast. And if there was among the many consequences of our work, certainly our work was a huge part of that, poor showing, because Joe definitely gave him a hard time.
Right. I'm going to come back to Reddit in a second briefly, but okay. So on the positive side, your work was discussed on Rogan, and a lot of people saw Eric respond to your work, however briefly. On the negative side, Eric is not engaging in debate with you.
That's right. He's never mentioned
naming.
my name.
Yeah, he's right. not naming. He's not naming you. He's not citing you, and he's criticizing you pretty harshly as a person, by implication.
Yeah.
By implication.
Yeah, by implication, right? Not direct, but by right. Implication. That's right.
Now, on the positive side, again, a lot of people on Reddit and YouTube have reacted negatively to Eric's response to your rebuttal on Rogan and on Clubhouse. And now you're making the rounds on comparatively low impact podcasts like Decoding the Gurus, The Wright Show, Eigenbros, and this one. My earlier comment was self-deprecating, just to make sure you understood. When I said take solace in the fact that you're on this show, I was joking. Just in case that didn't get across. Okay, so Tim, here's the part where I'm going to talk a little bit, okay? I'm going to tell you my current take on this affair, and you can respond if you'd like. I think I have one question for you, but you can respond to any of it. So independently of this conversation, I'm working on a video essay that examines established sense-making structures. The term sense-making structures comes from actually Brian Weinstein and the channel Rebel Wisdom. I think it's a useful term. So again, let me just rewind. So I'm currently independently working on a video essay that examines established sense-making structures and alternative ones. Established ones would be major newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post, television news networks like CNN and MSNBC, and academia. Alternative sense-making structures would be independent, often subscription or advertisement-based podcasts and YouTube channels and newspapers. So in the alternative sense-making landscape, it is often claimed that, so like in conversations within the alternative sense-making landscape, it is often claimed that established institutions play the role of gatekeeper. Now, we could debate the pros and cons of gatekeeping done well. That's an interesting debate. People I respect come down on different sides of whether even good gatekeeping is a good thing. By good gatekeeping, I mean like truly reprehensible moral positions or potentially dangerous misinformation. Should institutions gatekeep that stuff, or are the dangers of setting the precedent of gatekeeping, even when you do it well, such that you shouldn't do it? That's an interesting debate. We're not going to talk about that. Most critics of established sense-making institutions, the media, like the big newspapers, academia, they argue that these established institutions gatekeep badly, right? That they exclude important, valuable positions from serious consideration or rigorous engagement. Eric Weinstein makes this argument. So I'm interested in the question, is the alternative sense-making landscape doing a better job than the mainstream one? It's a complicated question, but the case of geometric unity is relevant in a few ways. First, Eric claims that geometric unity was suppressed by the established sense-making institutions. But if geometric unity is oversold and deeply flawed and incomplete, as you say, well, maybe the scientific establishment was right not to take it that seriously. And it would be rational for non-experts who follow Eric to place more confidence in the scientific establishment than they do in Eric's scientific views. So the case of geometric unity may be one data point in support of established sense-making structures, particularly academic science. Okay, second, we could ask, in the case of geometric unity, is the alternative sense-making landscape gatekeeping badly? That is, in the conversation about geometric unity, is the alternative sense-making landscape gatekeeping badly? Now, I want to say a couple of things here. So in both landscapes, established and alternative, there are elites, people who have a disproportionate capacity to control the narrative, to exclude certain ideas from consideration. In the established landscape, the elites are editors of major newspapers, tenured professors, and editors of peer-reviewed journals, decision makers at the major broadcast outlets. A lot of people in our society still trust these established institutions. And so the people leading those institutions can heavily shape the narrative by deciding who to hire and not to hire, who to publish and not to publish, who to platform and not to platform. The individuals making these decisions in the established institutions are human beings with political biases, character flaws, friendships with colleagues, and career and status incentives. All of those things can lead them to gatekeep badly in principle and in practice. Okay, in the alternative landscape, the same issue exists. Some figures are very popular. That is, they are trusted and viewed as authoritative by large numbers of people. Eric Weinstein is one such figure. Within the alternative landscape, these figures, these elites, can heavily shape the narrative by deciding whose signal to boost and who's not to boost. And they too are human beings with political biases, character flaws, friendships with colleagues, and career and status incentives. And all of those forces can again lead them to gatekeep badly. So my take on this situation is that Eric's character flaws are leading him to gatekeep badly. I could be wrong, but it seems pretty clear to me that in the conversation about geometric unity, you, Tim, do not deserve to be ignored or villainized. Yet Eric is ignoring you, and when you are brought up, he's borderline villainizing you, often by tenuous association. And he's bullying people like Joseph on Clubhouse. That's not fair. It's not good. Now, one important question here is precisely what are the character flaws that are leading Eric to respond to you as he has? I'm especially interested in whether he has lied. By lying, I mean intentionally deceiving his audience or his interlocutors. I don't claim or believe that he is lying. I don't know. He's definitely suggesting things about your project that are not true, but he may really believe them. The honesty question matters a lot to me. If Eric just has a distorted view of reality, that's not nearly as bad from an ethical standpoint as lying. And I wanted to ask you in this connection, I think I may have heard you say that, and this can be off the record if you want, but did he try to suppress any of your ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually relevant. And now that I've mentioned it, so I did mention it on the Bob Wright show. I had a comment and then Bob sort of pressed me on it. And I said, I can't go into more detail. So I still, unfortunately, can't go into more details because the third party involved, expressly doesn't want to be involved in this. But yeah, it is true, based on that source, that Eric has tried to directly get in the way of various aspects of the dissemination of geo. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, when I learned of this, I finally realized this is somehow, how do I say, for me, and sometimes I'm having fun. This part of this stuff is unsavory, but at a fundamental level, I'm not fighting for my life or anything like that. But when I learned about Eric's trying to suppress my work, I realized, wow, this guy is actually more morally reprehensible, let's say. And whether it's because he's delusional or he's just a bad person, I can't comment on that. But just at face value, the deliberate attempt to suppress is noteworthy. Yeah, and
I mean, it's kind of chilling to hear this, honestly. I'm guessing, if I had to guess, I'm guessing his view is if their paper gets out at the wrong time, it's going to lead people, it's going to discredit my theory unfairly because I haven't written my paper yet or something like I'm sure he has a moral justification. I'm guessing he has a moral justification in his mind. I'm absorbing this information for the first time, and it's chilling, actually.
Yeah, and it's funny, I did send you a clip, and I guess maybe you could splice it in at some point. But in episode 18 of The Portal podcast, he defines very specifically what he means by the disc. And the ironic thing is that he himself is guilty of the disc when it serves his purposes. And there's so many directions we can take this. So and in some sense, I think this is the most central topic to discuss. I think, when you reached out to me, you kind of wanted to, the way you framed this discussion was whether Eric is living up to the ideals of the IDW, right? And so in this clear instance, it's very disappointing both for myself and all his fans to learn that he is not the poster child of fighting against the disk. Actually, far worse, he's actually willing to use the disk when it serves his purpose. He defines the disk as institutions suppressing individuals that have valid criticism. So that's just an exact copy of the situation that's having right now. And, we did say that this was not a hit piece. So, the way in which this topic can be constructive is that, we can, talk about sort of, we could talk about just the substance of that itself, but we can also talk about things like, as I was sort of brainstorming where this can go, to what extent do we, for example, allow for exemptions because we're all human beings with conflicts of interest. So, for example, you say that you're against the disk, but in more extreme circumstances where you need to suppress something, say for your own survival, you might have to suppress or lie. Forget about the disk. Let's just say in general, we have certain codes of conduct, but we also have to breach them at certain times. And the question becomes, when can we do that? And how can we when is it legitimate to do that? And
by the way, I think a good definition of wisdom is like knowing the right answer to those questions in every case.
Right.
Yeah. Because there's no algorithm, there's no substantive principle that will get you there.
Yeah. And I think also it's very relevant today because, it's obvious that we live in this very pathological cancel culture society where the simplest transgression you make can offend someone, and then boom, you're canceled, and which is so problematic in many ways. But and what I want to say is, in a too simplistic culture, any breach of some stated code of conduct would lead you to be canceling, right? And then on the other extreme is someone who's just a complete bullshitter that doesn't care about the truth and will say one thing and practice another thing. And so what's interesting for both Eric and Brian is, where do they fall along the spectrum, right? So Eric, being, a champion of free thinking and open conversation, yet him employing the disk, and also Brian, him.
I'm going to get to Brian in a second.
Yeah, but I was going to say they all both fall guilty of this in the sense, or the way we're going to scrutinize their behavior is that, so Brian, he has a certain integrity as a scientist, and yet he's promoting Eric Weinstein. To what extent does that involvement compromise his integrity as a scientist? So I think one of the interesting things to analyze is in a constructive way, is sort of both for Eric, Brian's sake, and also just for the sake of everyone else who, we all have kind of conflicts in our life too. How do you reconcile sort of this disparity, right? So that to me is at least one interesting focal point.
Yeah, and I really admire and appreciate the tone, by the way. I do want to briefly, I chose my words carefully earlier, saying that the elites in both landscapes, they have political biases, character flaws, friendships with colleagues, and career and status incentives, all of which can lead them to gatekeep badly. And I think Eric's character flaws are leading him to gatekeep badly in this instance. Others who are friends with Eric or who have career or status incentives to maintain their relationship with him will go along with this unfairness, not criticize him for it, and or ignore people like you. And I think Brian Keating may fall into this category. And I don't say that to demonize him. Not wanting to anger your friend because he's your friend, or just wanting to widen your reach, even wanting higher status and relationships with cool people, all of which might flow out of a relationship with Eric Weinstein. Those aren't desires to be demonized. Like, we're human beings, it's fine. It's fine to want to be famous, I think. The question is, what are you willing to do to become famous? But in any case, I wouldn't demonize. Again, I'm speculating, but I'm guessing that some combination of friendship with Eric and maybe recognizing that Eric is a very valuable asset as Brian tries to develop in the alternative information landscape. Those are factors that are helping to explain his behavior here. Sure. And again, they're leading Brian Keating to gatekeep badly in the alternative information landscape. One thing I will say in Brian Keating's defense is that I think he's doing a good job of encouraging Eric to talk to more establishment scientists. some of whom have been very blunt with him, like Sabine Hassenfelder. So, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, although I'm not sure. How did I say? I'm not saying you're wrong. I think that's just the most charitable way of interpreting it. I was sort of interpreting Brian Keating with all his podcast episodes as trying to create a veneer of scientific legitimacy, bringing on these scientists to debate Eric when they're not the most qualified. And that's consistent with the fact that he's not interested when I come along, right? So he brings along Sabina to debate Eric when Sabina isn't the most qualified person to challenge him, right? She admits that she doesn't understand what's going on. Yep.
Hypothetically, if Eric were willing to talk to you, Brian would have you on. Maybe that's maybe that's tautological, but it's like
yes,
right. Yeah. Like he can't make that conversation happen, right? Between you and Eric, because Eric won't do it. But that's anyway, right. Go on.
That's I think that's fair to say. So anyway, what I was saying is so just to push back on your point that Brian deserves credit for Eric talking to scientists. I think it's the other way around. I think Brian is building up his popularity by having Eric on, and also legitimizing that by juxtaposing Eric with other scientists and having not a real debate, but some kind of a farce of a debate in some ways, because they're really not, they're just sort of talking past each other rather than engaging in the technical details, as is consistent with the fact that once there's actual criticism that surfaces, he's not interested in talking.
Okay, so the point I made so far is that, as with the established information landscape where the character flaws and career and status incentives and friendships and political biases of elites can lead them to gatekeep badly, the same issue exists in the alternative information landscape. And I think Eric and Brian kind of are a good case study of that argument at work. Now, on the other hand, this is very minor, but Eric is engaging with your arguments in the sense that, like, he did read your paper. Okay, it's a very minor thing, but at least there's that, right? At least there's the exchange of ideas in the sense that Eric read your ideas and came up with a kind of response to them. Okay, so that's one positive thing, but there are more positive things.
Well, in some sense, he had to, because, for example, Joe Rogan pressed him and things like that. So, sure.
Yeah, and I think it's possible that he did revise his paper to account for your critique.
I think that's more likely than not, but just something that I wasn't focused on thinking about. Yeah.
Okay, so another positive thing is that much of Eric's own audience is criticizing him for treating you and responding to you as he has. I'm thinking of Reddit threads, YouTube commentary, and the example of Joseph on Clubhouse, just that isolated example, where he is, saying, Eric, engage with this rebuttal. So I think this feedback from his audience, from his fans, et cetera, might affect his future behavior toward critics.
Yeah.
I was surprised
there were actually a lot of new negative comments in the Bob Wright show, which maybe we can address later, but I was actually surprised at how, at least to me and the people who can see through the BS, it's pretty clear, how bad Eric is behaving. But nevertheless, despite how, kind of clear it is and how well paved of a road it is to make that conclusion with, the Clubhouse breakdown and things like that, you still have people that are, trolling me for hard to understand reasons. But we can get to that.
I think it's clear to you, but genuinely not clear to them. And I think this conversation might help a little bit, honestly.
Yeah, I do think so. Yeah.
So, I hope some people see the conversation. I just wanted to mention about Reddit. I don't use Reddit ever, but in preparation for this conversation, I did look at the threads about Weinstein and Rogan, and I'm kind of conflicted about them because on the one hand, people are often very insightful in analyzing the psychodynamics of the individuals and their interactions and the subtext of the conversation. But on the other hand, they focus on the negative and magnify it, in my opinion. Like you could watch the conversation between Rogan and Eric and have a different, more charitable take, which is like, Eric's not perfect. Rogan's not perfect. Eric annoyed Rogan. Rogan was a bit aggressive. Eric probably got his feelings hurt, but they got through it, as friends do. Not the greatest conversation, a little awkward, but little conflicts and imperfections are part of life and authentic interactions. and like Reddit kind of made it sound like a catastrophe. And so Reddit, again, like very insightful things are said, but also I think it just magnifies the negative, kind of like a lot of things these days. Okay, so
yeah,
but in any case, go ahead.
You know, the Reddit. Maybe this is recency bias, but so like I felt like when I first released this stuff, there was a lot more negative stuff on Reddit, and then it eventually diminished as my credibility started increasing. And it's funny because with the latest Bob Wright podcast, from what it was cross-posted many places, and they were all positive comments from what I could see. It was actually quite surprising. Whereas it's the YouTube one that is the cesspool right now, and it's funny. I mean, I'll just mention it now because the funny thing is, and this is actually ties into this thing I said earlier about sort of, actually, I guess I haven't said it yet, but sort of, basically all of this stuff about conversation is the need to have like a nuanced conversation, which is why it's great to have this sort of a conversation like this in the first place, because with conversations, it's not like, oh, you said one thing bad and boom, you're canceled. It's sort of an iterative thing where we're trying to come to terms and understand each other. And this is a great example because if you look at the reason I was hated the most on the Bob Wright show, it was just because of this kind of throwaway comment I made, not knowing the consequences. But right when the show opens, I mentioned that, the reason why my conversation with Bob is interesting, one of the reasons is that, because, we're going to talk about Eric, but, Eric also has a brother, Brett, and they've both been involved in information/misinformation in various forms, whether it's information or misinformation, depends on whether you agree or disagree, obviously. And then I said, Eric for GU and Brett for anti-vac, not realizing, okay, it shows you how ignorant I am in some cases, so I'm much more of a scientific person than a political person, but I was using anti-vac in the most loose sense of him promoting ivermectin as an alternative to COVID, and him being skeptical of the COVID vaccine, and therefore he's anti-COVID vaccine, which is a mouthful. Nobody uses that terminology. So I just use anti-vac, just like when someone says, someone's a racist. It's not like you need to be racist against all races. If you're racist towards one group, that would still sort of count as racist, right? So I used anti-vac in the most loose sense, not that he's anti-all vax, which is maybe what the common anti-vac position is. But anyways,
by the way, I mentioned to you that I'm working on this video essay, and I'm basically looking at various case studies. This is one of them, but ivermectin is another one of them.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know what I'm going to ultimately argue about that, but I do think Brett and his wife, Heather, are doing a better job than Eric of engaging with substantive criticism. Like a piece came out in Quillette, criticizing Brett's public statements about ivermectin, and Brett and Heather had an entire podcast like responding to the content of that article, and they're also coming up with a written response. So just with respect to the exchange of ideas, they're doing a better job of engaging the substance of their critics' arguments than Eric has done, I think.
I see. It's funny because in my social group, there's I guess obviously, like Decoding the Gurus, there's a huge bias against Brett. I have to say, I honestly really haven't been following Brett. My expertise is in the area of Eric, so so I will continue to do the division of labor or expertise in that fashion. So I don't really, to be honest, I'm not qualified at all to really comment on Brett. I just know that in my circle, there's a lot of people who characterize him as someone who's promoting false information dangerously. Maybe you disagree with that, but I'm just saying there are certainly people who agree with that.
Right.
I haven't watched enough and studied his material enough to have my own well-informed opinion. But back to the original issue, which is that I made this throwaway comment that seemed to have derailed much of the episode for most people because of this off comment. And so what I was trying to say, just to tie this back into the theme, it's like the reason why it's important to have a conversation so that we can work out such things, because we don't always know whether things are just accidental or intentional. And in my case, it was an accidental misstep, just use a casual word like that. And so to silver lining for all this is that, we should obviously try to be charitable when we critique others. It's unfortunate in the case of Eric and Brian that they're not willing to have a conversation. So it's hard. It becomes increasingly harder and harder to become charitable as they continue to refuse and engage in other tactics. But anyways, that's just a little maybe plug for myself in terms of trolls and wrapping it up with misinformation. But yeah, I did not intend to throw Brett sloppily under the bus. So we should timestamp this part and absolve myself of that. But anyways,
that's really funny because I really enjoyed that conversation. That was my favorite of the conversations that you had that I heard. And it's funny to think that all of that great content got sort of obscured for some people, or just ignored. Like all that great content was ignored by some people because of something that wasn't central that you said without much thought at the beginning.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, I have no scientific standing to adjudicate between the substantive arguments on both sides of ivermectin. I just, so much of this is about figuring out who it is reasonable to trust.
Right.
I mean, there's almost no issue. I mean, there are flat earthers who could out debate me on that question. I'm guessing. I've come across enough brilliant people with really out there ideas that I've realized, like, I myself don't have sufficient rational grounds, just abstracting from all sense-making institutions, just what I know and have reason to believe. There are very few beliefs that I actually have sufficient rational grounds if I'm debating like the most sophisticated proponent of the alternative view, even with something as crazy as like the world being round. I'm not saying I'm a flat earther. I'm saying this is a problem, like for figuring out what to believe. Anyway. So I'm saying, on the other hand, Eric is engaging with your arguments in the sense that he at least read your paper, which is good, and may have revised in response to it. Much of Eric's own audience is criticizing him. Reddit threads, YouTube commentary, the isolated example of Joseph on Clubhouse. Third, some major elites in the alternative landscape are pressing him to engage critics. And here I'm thinking of Rogan. Now, of course, Rogan is much bigger than Eric, so he does not have the career or status incentive to stay on his good side that someone like Brian might have. I think as Rogan's platform has become more influential, I think that he's come to feel that he has more of a personal responsibility to subject his guests' ideas to critical scrutiny. I've heard some people who know him say that, and that's interesting.
That's good, right? I don't really listen to much Rogan. His podcasting style isn't my style, given my limited budget for podcasts. I have other people I listen to, but yeah, I am vaguely aware that Joe Rogan's got a lot of heat for when he either says something that isn't well founded, or also just kind of brings along guests that might do that. So he's somehow, he has this is the question of how much responsibility he has in terms of curating his guests, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. And I think, he's evolved a lot in that area. I think it sounds like, as you would expect, right? I mean, when he started, it was nothing, right? And now it's like as big as big can be. This is not important, but I also think Rogan may be the sort of person who won't be friends with someone if it requires not criticizing them. And again, I'm just trying to think about like the argument I made about how friendship, career and status incentives, influence people to gatekeep badly. The career and status factor isn't really applicable in this case because Rogan is far above Weinstein. And maybe with regard to friendship, because I think they are friends, but Rogan may be the sort of person who won't be friends with someone if it means never criticizing them. And then finally, the final good thing I want to mention is that your signal is getting boosted. And Bob Wright made this point too, but I would say your signal is getting boosted by a lot of minor elites in the alternative information landscape, like Decoding the Gurus, Eigenbros, and Bob Wright. And that may continue and grow. Like, I think your story would be of interest to Rebel Wisdom, for example. In fact, if anyone can bring you and Eric together, it would be Rebel Wisdom, I think. And that would be fascinating. I think, well, maybe it's not important to Joe Rogan, but since he has like platformed geometric unity, I think he should probably have you on. Like, I mean, I don't know him, but I just think
that's very flattering. I mean, I'm not. Let's be honest. I'm not going to decline if he invites me. But I'm also not going to.
Joe, thanks, but I've got better things to do. Yeah.
That's right. But I'm not going to be arrogant enough to assume that he would be interested in me. I don't. To be fair, actually, it's funny because I do watch MMA fights every now and then. It's hard to like, oh, Joe Rogan's the MMA commentator too, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, I don't. Okay, I mean, it's clear that it's not impossible that I would be on, but I don't. It's not. It's also I shouldn't expect it either. So
yeah,
so,
I mean, it's possible that this will just disappear, and Eric will go on talking about geometric unity, and no one will ever hear about Tim Nguyen other than the
you really.
I
don't think that's possible because I'm. How do I say? Actually, here's the funny thing I find. Like, I actually thought that if I were Eric, right, and this came out, I thought the way he would handle it would be as a politician would, which is just to kind of dismiss it silently in some vague way that doesn't draw attention to it. Like, oh, yeah, there's been some criticisms. I'm thinking about it. I'll get back to it. Not release anything and just mute it out of existence, right? If in that world, like we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But for whatever reason, he keeps rocking the boat, like especially with the Clubhouse incident, right? And so, so what I'm saying is that if he wants to, mute me, then he should just stop talking about physics, right, and just move on with his life. So that would be, if Eric really wants me to not get any more attention, he should just drop his whole physics shtick. And he's interested in many other things that I think he'd be okay if he would just drop the physics thing.
Yeah, and what I said at the beginning about liking Eric and valuing his contribution, for me it's all the non-physics stuff. I mean, it's banal and almost annoying when people say this. I don't agree with a lot of conclusions he reaches, but I learn a ton from him. Like, he's very insightful, unbelievably smart, as is Brett. So yeah.
Yeah, but it seems that he really, for whatever reason, and maybe that this is his character flaw, he doesn't want to let go, of his stake in physics. And so as long as he continues to insist on that, I'm going to be around, right? So, so yeah.
Okay, if you get disappeared, I'm going to get really worried. Okay.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I'll be there to tell your story. Okay.
But yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I think Eric has handled this quite poorly from a PR perspective.
Yeah.
I think he can't both have a claim to physics and ignore me at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, this has been great. Thank you again. I've really enjoyed this.
Great. Yeah. Sure.